Society Hall. This is On the Issues, and today we are releasing the latest results of a new Marquette University Law School poll. Joining me, as he always does for the release, is the poll's director, Professor Charles Franklin. And Charles, let's begin, as we always do, by talking about when we were in the field, the size of the sample, and even the composite of the sample.
Yes, so, since nothing has happened since this time for us to talk about, we were in the field last Thursday through Monday night, the 24th through 28th, Thursday through Monday. A little inside baseball. I had submitted the final version of the instrument Monday afternoon when I got a text message saying there might be news at 5 o'clock. So fortunately, from our point of view, we could change the instrument that night, and so the timing was great. It was really appreciate coordinating that with the poll. But it was close. So we did that. We interviewed 803 registered voters, our usual sample size. That has and normally I wait to an election year to develop this cough, but I'm ahead of the game this year, so next fall could be really interesting, so excuse me as I make horrible noises. Anyway, with 803 respondents for the whole sample, the margin of error is 4.1 percentage points. We have a subsample of 321 Republicans and independents who lean Republican. That's our Republican sample for the primary. That has a margin of error of 6.5%. And for Democrats, there are 394 Democrats with a margin of error of 5.9%. So that's, can't believe this. That's the rundown of that's the rundown of our usual design. It's really not a motion, it's something else. Just get choked up talking about margin. I apologize. Yeah, exactly. Let me tell you a little bit about the makeup of the sample. In this sample, the partisan breakout is 40% Republican plus leaners and 49% Democrat plus leaners with 9% pure independents. Okay? For comparison, over the previous 29 surveys, going back to 2012, the average has been 43 Republican, 47 Dem, and 9% independent. So we're a little more Democratic, a little less Republican than the overall average, though well within that 4.1% margin of error. It's worth noting that what's going on here is not so much the partisans as it is the leaners. So I just want to give you a little context of that as well. If you look over the 3 surveys we've done this year, April, August, and now September, the Republican percentage has been 24, 27, and 25, leaving the leaners out. 24, 27, 25. The long run average is 27. So we're 2 points light from the long term. We've seen fluctuation around that. But the leaning Republicans have been 15, 15, and 15 compared to a long run average of 16. But over on the Democratic side, the leaning Democrats have been 19, 19, and 19, but the long run average is 16. So what we've seen in this past year, and the Democrats are 30, 28, and 30 with a long run average of 31. So what you're seeing that's a little bit different in the 3 samples this year is that whereas independent Republicans and independent Democrats are normally the same size, 16% each, we're getting about 3% more leaning Democrats this time and 1% fewer lean Republicans. So that's what's going on with the partisan makeup of the sample.
And as we always say, these are live phone interviews and a growing number of cell phones
Yes.
in the the sample?
45% cell, 55% landline, which is the Centers for Disease Control of all people produce the best estimates of cell phones, and that's where they say the state is.
Well, let's get right to the results. And as Charles mentioned a week ago Friday, the governor announced that he was going to drop out of the Republican presidential race. And so these numbers reflect, I guess, the first results of any polling that I've seen in state since the governor's decision, Charles. So let's begin with Governor Walker's job approval in our latest poll.
All right. Nuts. There we go. 37% approved, 59% disapprove. This is in line with where we've seen things going this year. Here's the long-term trend in all of our polling, and you can see the very sharp difference between where we were during the fall campaign last year and the rising disapproval in each of the three polls this year, the declining approval. That was at 39-57 last time versus 37-59 this time. So not much movement, but still a little bit more negative than it was last time.
And of course, much of the speculation since the governor's announcement has surrounded the question of whether or not he would run for a third term if he were to serve out this second term. We asked people whether they wanted the governor to run for a third term.
And they're not very positive about that overall. 35% would support a third term bid, 62% would not like to see him do that. We'll get those down by party a little bit later.
You bet, you bet.
Though among Republicans, it's of course much higher support, but we'll go through those in a little bit.
So the governor is out of the Republican field in the presidential race, and so we wanted to take a look at how the candidates are doing in Wisconsin without Governor Walker on the slate of potential candidates. And Charles, with his absence, we've had some big changes.
We have. One of the things we asked last time was how much is Walker holding the rest of the field back? He was at 25% support in the GOP primary last time. So if you've got a favorite son taking up that much, where would that vote go? Little did we realize it would become relevant so soon. But it turns out that Donald Trump, who had been at only 9% last time, receives a pretty healthy boost here to take first place at 20%. Ben Carson in second at 16, Rubio at 14, Fiorina 11, and then everybody else is below 10. You can see Bush and Paul at 7 and 5. So that's our top 6. Then Cruz, who's actually tied with Paul at 5. Kasich, Huckabee, and Christie all at 3, Santorum at 1, and then Pataki at 0, and here are the bottom 3. I probably should have put the last 4 all on one slide together, but these folks are having some trouble making headway in the state.
We'll look at where the Walker voters went in just a moment, Charles, but just to add to this, there's a question on our poll. You can find our poll on our website, look at all the results, but I just wanted to touch on this with you because it is interesting. We asked people for their first and second choice in the Republican presidential race.
Right.
And Marco Rubio does well.
Does quite well. I have to get my cheat sheet here. But if you look at Rubio with 14% first choices, what you saw back here on this slide, but he's the second choice of 17%. So an alternative way of measuring strength is first choice plus second choice. If you do that, then combined, Rubio has 31% potential support. Second place is Carson, who's the first choice of 16, second choice of an additional 12, putting him at 28 combined. Fiorina's at 11 first and 15 second choice, putting her at 26. And Trump is interesting because with his 20% first choice, he's the second choice of only 5%. So the combination there is at 25. I won't go through the rest, but Bush is at 7 and the second choice is 10 for him. So that puts him down ways, as he is down ways in the first choices as well. But combined, he's also down.
So when the governor made his decision to drop out of the race, he made a comment, and I think it was pretty clear. He was talking about Donald Trump, that he was not necessarily a fan of how the Trump campaign had been doing its business. And so I'm sure these next results we're about to show are probably not going to make the governor all that happy. Where did his voters go?
Trump. 22%. Let me give you a little bit of background about this. Another question we asked was, and you'll see more of this later, if Governor Walker had stayed in the race, would you have supported him in the primary, supported another Republican, not voted, or something else? So we're looking here at the 28% who said they would have still supported Governor Walker had he stayed in the race. 55% said they'd vote for some other Republican. And to be clear, we're talking only about Republican voters here, Republicans and leaning Republicans. So we can take that question, the people who say they would have voted for Walker had he stayed in, and what you're seeing is the vote for the remaining candidates among that group of would-be Walker voters. So the result is that Trump gets 22%, a little bit more than the 20% he gets overall. Rubio seconded, picking up 14%, Carson at 11%, Cruz at 10%, and then the rest are down below 10%.
Let's take a look at the Democrats and how they're faring in Wisconsin, the presidential candidates.
Well, Clinton still leads at 42%, with Sanders at 30%. But Joe Biden, who's not yet a candidate, and may or may not be, is at 17%. The other three you see are sort of like the bottom tier of Republicans, just not getting any traction. This gives a move up for Biden. If we compare this to the August poll, both Clinton and Sanders were a couple of points higher than they are today, but Biden was at 12, so he's picked up 5 points in the month since we did our last poll.
The other big race in November of 2016 is the U.S. Senate race in Wisconsin, the likely rematch between the incumbent Ron Johnson and the former Senator Russ Feingold. How are they doing in our latest results?
Here, the result is they're bumping around quite a bit. Feingold is at 50 in this newest poll versus 36 for Johnson. And you can see some neither and don't knows in there as well. But that's quite a change from last month when it was 47-42. So we've gone from a 5-point Feingold advantage last time to a 14-point this time. But wait, if we go back to April, it was Feingold 54, Johnson 38. So this race is just bouncing around. The changes in partisanship that we mentioned earlier could account for something like 2 to 4% of the shift from last poll to this one, but not going from 5 to 14 points. So this is bouncing around. Now, why is it bouncing around?
Why is it? Yes.
And so get slightly ahead of our script. The answer is people don't know these guys that well.
Which is amazing.
It is amazing. It's sort of stunning. I've emphasized in the past that for Senator Johnson, it's like 38% don't know him, but it's in the upper 20s for former Senator Feingold. But when you look at the two together, what do you see? 55%, just barely more than half of registered voters in the state, know the two of them well enough to give either a favorable or an unfavorable rating to both of them. Okay? 7% can rate Johnson but not Feingold. 18% can rate Feingold but not Johnson. And 19% can't rate either of the two candidates. So when 45% of the sample is not familiar with one or both of the candidates, it's not terribly surprising that the race is unstable at this point and bouncing around quite a bit. I think it's probably worth remembering that With the presidential race, you can at least say that we have primary candidates out on both sides. They're actively campaigning for the primary, so people are talking about them. The Senate campaign is still awfully low salience for voters right now. Both sides are beginning to try to stir the waters a bit, but I think, as this pretty clearly demonstrates, voters themselves are just not focused in on the race. Now, there are a couple of changes as well that we'll get to in a second, but overall, I think this is maybe we'll repeat this one each poll for a while just to see how this changes over time.
One of the things we do with our polling is ask a question about whether people have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of various candidates. We ask that of both Feingold and Johnson, Charles.
So instead of combining them, let's look at them individually. With Feingold, his favorables at 42, unfavorable at 32. And as I mentioned, 26% can't rate him. So that's a net plus 10 favorable. But if we go back a month, he was at 42-30. So the 42 is the same, but the 30 has gone from 30 to 32. Well within the margin of error, but you can see a little bit of a shift there in the unfavorables. Not much change in the unable to rate. But with Senator Johnson, he's quite down this time. Favorable at 27, unfavorable at 36. And you can see the 37 this month that couldn't rate him. But a month ago, that was more at parity, 30% favorable, 31 unfavorable, and 38 couldn't rate. So we see a little bit of a net decline for Feingold, though he remains a net positive on the favorability measure. But for Senator Johnson, he goes from just slightly net unfavorable to this 9-point net unfavorable. So if you're looking for if you can't believe it's just random noise between last time and this time, what seems to have shifted over that time is a little less favorability to Senator Johnson, and only a sliver of a change for Feingold. But I think I would stress that earlier slide that shows 45% aren't that confident about these two.
We're going to show you some hypothetical presidential matchups in Wisconsin. And before we do that, we should say, Charles, that we're only going to look at a few of these, and there's a reason for that. Why only a few?
Because 3 Democrats times 15 Republicans is more questions than I can possibly ask. The other
That's true, though.
Right, it's absolutely true. That would be the entire survey if we tried to do that. The other is, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We haven't gotten to the primary yet. And so rather than try to squeeze in 15 or 20 comparisons, I don't think you would gain very much from it. But more to the point, as you'll see with these results, the difference between either Democrat and any of the Republicans we match them with is a matter of 1 to 3 or 4 percentage points. We're not seeing much difference. And if you look at national polling and polling in other states, you see this, that preferences between Clinton and anybody in the field or Sanders and anybody in the field tend to be pretty stable. There are a little bit of differences, but not a lot. So doing an additional 5 or 6 Republicans against either or add Biden in, those Democrats, doesn't gain you very much because people are largely reporting their partisan views right now and not distinguishing very well from the things they like or dislike about the other parties' candidates in particular. That said, we have tried to ask different candidates at different times while still paying attention to who the front runners are. And so that's how I have come to decide which candidates to include. So if you don't like it, complain to Mike. But I did it. So with that as the lead-in, let's look at Clinton versus Bush. Clinton at 50, Bush at 38, a 12-point margin. That, again, is bigger than the 5-point margin we saw a month ago when we had that same pairing of candidates. if we look at Clinton versus Rubio, who remember is top of the line on that first plus second choice and who gained quite a bit from last time to this, though he's not in first, second, or third place. Then the Clinton advantage is 8 points, 48-40. We don't have a previous match of these two, so I can't show you the past. And if you look at Clinton versus Trump, 50-36, a 14-point Clinton lead. We did ask about that pair last time, and it was 51-35, so very slight change between those two.
And Bernie Sanders, how would he
Bernie Sanders, the Twitter world wanted Bernie Sanders. So here's Bernie Sanders. I'm joking, but I did see a lot of tweets about where's Sanders. So here we go. Sanders at 49-39 against Bush. If we look at Sanders-Rubio, it's 49-36, and Sanders-Trump 53-34. Seems like Clinton-Bush, Clinton has just a slightly better advantage than Sanders-Bush, but with the other pairings, Rubio and Trump, Sanders seems to be just slightly better, but I would stress how modest the differences are between the comparisons.
Let's go back to those the Walker numbers, Charles. The support for Scott Walker's third term, if you were to seek a third term. You made reference to this, that Republicans, generally speaking, would like to see him run for a third term. Do we have those numbers?
We do somewhere here. I guess I could just click this instead of looking at my previous slides, couldn't I? But, you know, I need the security blanket. So here you go. These are people who support a third term for Governor Walker, would like to see him run for a third term by party ID. And so among Republicans, 79% say they would like for him to run. It's 65% against people who are independent but lean to the Republican Party. But then it drops off pretty precipitously among independents to just 15%. And not terribly surprising, Democrats are not real fans of the third term at 9 and 6. For just a slight bit of perspective, Republicans voted for Governor Walker about 94% last time, and leaning Republicans voted for him about 86% last time in November, last November. So both of these show strong support at almost 80 and almost 2/3, but both of those are notably below the support that they gave to Governor Walker in the votes last time.
What would it have looked like if the governor had stayed in the race? Were people still willing to support him in Wisconsin?
Yes. So here the question, I alluded to it earlier. If Governor Walker had remained in the race, would you vote for, and this is of Republicans and leaning Republicans only, would you have voted for Walker, would you have voted for some other Republican, not vote, you don't know, or you would have voted in the Democratic primary? So Walker held 28% versus the 25% that he got in a month ago with a different question wording, right? Last time he was one of the 17 candidates we read. This time it's this question of if he had stayed in, so it's a hypothetical. Still, the two numbers, 25 and 28, are pretty close to one another. And more than half saying that they would have voted for another Republican in the primary.
So let's see how people, based on their party ID, felt about the governor's decision, whether they wish he would have stayed in the race, they like the fact that he was in the race, but they understand why he got out, or they just wish he hadn't run at all. So let's start with Republicans.
So here again, you'd expect huge party differences, and you do, but look within Republicans and leaners. So first, just among people who call themselves Republicans, 25%, and to be clear, the question is, are you pleased that he ran and wish he had stayed in? So that's 25%. Are you pleased that he ran but it was time to get out? That's the get out here. 40%. Or you wish he had not run, for 30%, and I don't know, 3. So put those two together, 65% of Republicans are pleased that he ran, but most thought that it was time to get out. And a minority, 30%, wish he hadn't run at all. When we move to independents who lean Republican, and usually voted in Republican primaries, then it's quite different. Only 10% were pleased and wished he'd stayed in, 35% pleased and time to get out, but a slim majority, 51%, saying they wished he had not run. Independents, focus over on the right, 67% wish he hadn't run, and only a slim 6% wish he had stayed in. And among leaning Democrats, it's 77 not run, and pure Democrats, 79% didn't run.
Charles, over time we've seen a sort of a subtle change in how people view the governor's ideology, say from October of 2014 when we were polling just before the election to this poll. There's a little movement in those numbers.
There is. And this is something that certainly was talked about in the coverage of his primary campaign, his presidential campaign. His rhetoric seemed to push a bit to the right on several issues during the course of the roughly January till September period. And it did have some effect. We asked people to place themselves on a liberal conservative scale. Place yourself as very conservative, moderate, liberal, or very liberal. And in 2014, as well as this year, we've asked people now, where would you place Governor Walker? And when we look at that this time, this September, it's 38%, the largest single category, say he's very conservative, 35% conservative, 7% moderate, and a combined 10% liberal or very liberal. You might scratch your head on that. It actually turns out that a fair share of the people that rate him that way call themselves very conservative. So it actually may not be completely misunderstanding the terms, but folks that are unhappy, or that are very conservative and for some reason are not very happy with something that he's done. And of course there is some confusion about what the labels mean as well. But that 38 and 35 this year contrasts with what we got at the end of the gubernatorial campaign last year. So this is our final October poll after all of the campaign had gone on. So sort of a summary judgment. And then it was notably more people said he was just conservative, 42%, and only 31% said he was very conservative. Also, there was a little bit more, 10% moderate versus 7% moderate. And the stuff over on the right didn't change very much. People are slightly more confused now about where to put him. The don't know rate was 6 then, it's 9 this time. But you can see that the shift in the conservative side there is somewhat notable and does represent a shift in the perception of his ideology compared to what folks thought at the end of the campaign last year.
Talk for a couple minutes about an interesting finding in this poll. By most standards, the economy has certainly improved from a few years ago, but there still appears to be, Charles, a fair amount of angst out there among the citizens of Wisconsin. They're not so sure about things. And so we asked people over the last 12 months, for example, do you think things have gotten better or worse, stayed the same?
Right. We're not super pessimistic, but we're not real optimistic either. Last year, 27% worse. Most people, 47%, think it stayed about the same. But this does represent a little bit of an increase, let me put it the other way, a decrease in optimism. And it's not so much people are saying everything's worse, but they're saying, it's going to stay about the same. Okay? So if we go back almost exactly a year, we were in the field September 25th to 28th last year. So the same question, looking back for that previous 12 months, 30% thought the economy had gotten better over the year leading up to September of 14, 29 worse, and 41 the same. So not a gigantic shift, but a little bit of movement into the same category and away from the better category.
But it's looking forward that is pretty interesting.
We are optimists sometimes. Actually, in most of the times we've asked this question, the view of the future is a little bit more optimistic than the view of the past. That just seems very steady in our data. 25% this time think the economy will get better over the next 12 months, 20% worse, but see that big 50% that think it'll stay about the same. Stay about the same is okay if you think it's pretty good. Stay about the same is not so great if you don't think it's very good. We should ask a question about that next time. Because we don't ask the question in terms of, well, how would you rate today's economy? Rather, we ask it in terms of how it's changing. If we go back the year, people were more optimistic last year about this 12 months that we've just finished. So a year ago, 34% thought it would be better versus the only 24% that now, looking backwards, say it actually is better. So in that sense, about a 10-point gap between the optimism September a year ago versus the retrospective look now over that time.
So the news has been dominated recently by the visit of Pope Francis to the United States, and we've done some polling on the Pope at our own risk. But we wanted to look at the most recent numbers, which probably reflect some of the enthusiasm that you saw during his visit.
Yeah, in August, we asked a question about his favorability, and we actually put it on in conjunction with evaluations of his encyclical on climate change, which we were also asking some questions about. We wanted to see if there was a relationship. But happily, his visit coincided with our time conducting the interviews this week. So some of our interviews were conducted the day after he arrived, the second day after, the third day after, and so on. There's not much of a discernible trend over the days that we were interviewing. It bounces around a little bit, but the results are all basically the same. So the shifts took place pretty quickly, judging from that. Where we see him today is 66% favorable rating, 12% unfavorable, and 21 that either haven't heard or don't know. But that's actually fairly striking compared to before his visit a month ago, when it was only 51% favorable, the same 12% unfavorable, but a lot more don't know, it's 36%. So it seems that the visit really has made more people who weren't previously aware of him, and becoming aware. At least the net movement has all been into favorable with no real change in the unfavorable rating. If you look at it by religion, perhaps not surprisingly, among Catholics, favorability went up by 5 percentage points and was already the highest favorability. But among Protestants, it went up by 21 points. And among people with no religious attachment, it went up by 16 points. So there's quite a bit of movement, presumably directly caused by his visit and the coverage of it and attention being paid to it.
One of the things we do in virtually all of our polls, or have done in virtually all of our polls, I think all of our polls, we've asked for job approval ratings on President Obama, much as we do with Governor Walker. How did the president do in this latest survey?
He's bumped up a bit. He's at 51 approved, 45 disapproved. A month ago it was 48-48, so that's up 3 points on approval, down 3 points on disapproval.
And he's hovered in that like 50 or low 50s down to low to mid 40s over time.
In our data, he's generally stayed in that range, which is not far from the national range, but tends to be a shade higher than the national. So if you look at national polling over the last really couple of 3 years even, at least since the re-election, his approval rating has bounced around somewhere between nationally, somewhere between about and on average, not individual polls, which vary a lot more. But on average, it's bounced around between about 42 or 3 and about 45 or 46. And disapproval has been a little bit higher than that, but again, bounced around. In our data, we've typically seen him a little closer to parity between approve and disapprove, with some months like this one where it bumps up a point or 2 or 3 more favorable, other months where it's at parity or even a little bit below that, a little bit more unfavorable. We don't see much of a trend of this either going up or down in the state any more than we see much of a trend in the national data, where over short periods of time we've seen some ups and downs. But if you look at it over certainly the second term, but even if you look at it since about 2011, there's been less variability in President Obama's national approval rating than for any other president, going back to Harry Truman, or actually we even have some data from Franklin Roosevelt. So it's really quite striking that both the supporters and the opponents of the president seem really attached to their views and are not changing very much, and compared to President Bush or President Clinton before, or President Reagan or the first President Bush. Much less variability in Obama's ratings.
We have one final set of numbers we want to show you. This is a favorable and unfavorable rating for the Lieutenant Governor of Wisconsin, Rebecca Clayfish. There was certainly a lot of speculation when the governor was running for president about what her political future might hold, and we decided to keep her in the survey despite the governor's decision. And it's probably a good thing to at least get a baseline.
It's good to keep in touch. We drop in various statewide elected officials from time to time, and not measuring them every single time, but keeping an eye on it. And it was her turn. So a favorable rating of 21, an unfavorable of 29, and 49% not aware, not able to rate. You see the same thing we were seeing earlier with Johnson and Feingold, except a little bit bigger. Lieutenant governors, even a very active one, have trouble breaking through to public awareness. Last year, the Attorney General's race, both candidates struggled to get the don't know rate below 80%. And so this is not unusual or surprising. The last time we measured the Lieutenant Governor, she was a little better off, 29 favorable, 25 unfavorable, and 45 weren't able to rate. So part of this is that measure was in October last year, just a little bit before the election, so you'd expect a little more awareness then. Also, you see in this month's data a bit of a decline in Governor Walker's approval, bit of a decline in her favorability, bit of a tick up in Obama's favorability. So some part of that is the slightly more Republican or Democratic composition of the sample. But the changes you're seeing on these individual measures are substantially bigger than the modest differences in partisan makeup. So I think we're seeing some short-term forces, perhaps coupled with governors leaving the race, but perhaps coupled with broader events, which at the moment are slightly disadvantaging Republicans.
And we should mention that the Lieutenant Governor Clayfish, will be here at the law school in a little over more than 2 weeks, I believe. So if you're interested, feel free to join us.
For those of you who go to look at the website for the top lines and the crosstabs, they're all there. We asked a number of questions that we're not talking about today about public libraries in the state for an upcoming conference that we'll be talking about and inviting you to soon. So I just didn't want to put them in here, but if you can't wait, they're on the website under the top lines. Also a set of items on criminal justice and punishment, which our colleague Michael O'Hare here in the law school is doing. This is a long-standing set of items that we carry for him, but he will probably post something on the law school blog about those items in the coming days.
And it's fair to say, Charles, that because of the nature of polling, you can't keep people on the phone forever. So there were a few less policy questions in today's poll than we typically do.
Yeah. I joked about 3 Democrats and 15 Republicans,
Right.
but time really is limited. We already try people's patience with going about 15 to 16 minutes. This one ran a bit longer than that. That's actually why we interviewed on Monday night, as well as taking a 5-day period to complete the interviews, simply because we were a couple of minutes longer than we normally are. But that was because we were doing this work on libraries, communities, and the criminal justice items, in addition to the things we talked about this morning.
Okay, let's take some questions from the audience. If you're in the seating bowl, please press down on the rim, not on the button, but on the rim. Keep your finger on it to be able to hear your question. If you're somewhere else in the room, not in front of one of those buttons, Ryan will have a microphone for you, and Ryan is over there. So anybody have a question about the results, feel free to ask. Charles, you've answered every single question.
Well, I'm not allowing that.
Anybody?
You know what they say about professors is that the average student takes 30 seconds to raise their hand. The average professor waits 10 seconds for a hand to go up. So, you know, I've been schooled by my freshmen. You can't wait me out.
Let me do 2. I found 2. I'm going to go here and then here. Okay.
Charles, what is the significance of all that we're seeing, Iowa and South Carolina, and how do the delegates actually get chosen, and what is their commitment, and what does the broad public have in terms of impact on what the party does?
Yeah, that's a great question. We need a day-long conference on this. Because the states differ in how they allocate delegates. So in Iowa, for example, you'll hear a poll result about who wins the Iowa caucus from an exit poll, though it's actually an entrance poll. It's interviewing people when they come in to the caucus. But the actual votes that take place there are votes to elect delegates to go to the county convention, which then elects delegates to the state convention, which then actually decides on who goes to the presidential nomination conventions, the party conventions. So it's very complicated. And on the Democratic side, if a candidate doesn't have a minimum amount of votes, their supporters can go over and form a coalition with one of the other candidates. The Republicans do it more simply. They just mark a ballot when they come in, but the Democrats have to naturally take a lot more time to reach the same result. So that's the one example of how different it is, whereas, you know, a week later we do North Carolina or New Hampshire, and it's a straight primary, just like we're all used to, except it's an open primary, so people can vote in whichever primary they want. Then we go on to other primaries with different rules. There's also, as you know, delegate allocation rules between winner-take-all and proportional allocation of delegates. So it's really a mishmash. It's depending on how you view it, it's the genius of American federalism or it's the curse of American federalism. That this is one of the things we delegate to the states to handle, so there's no single national policy on how the nominations process works. And most states, or at least many states, then in turn delegate it to the parties to manage. So the parties in Iowa actually organize and run the caucuses. You can't go to the Secretary of State's website and find an official vote count because they never do one. It's just done by the parties. So if you love parties and you love local control, you should love the Iowa caucuses and this system that we have. If you like a little order in things and common rules across different states, then you might not be so thrilled about it. So that's the quick version of that.
What percentage of the delegates go to the convention committed? I mean, what is all of this commotion? Does it commit somebody?
These days, the vast majority go committed. And the only way that opens up is if someone drops out a bit later in the process, you know, after the last primary in June, for example. You know, every year we have a conversation, sometime in this winter usually, about maybe this will be the year we have a brokered convention and nobody can win on the first ballot. Well, that hadn't happened for a long, long time. And I'd be really surprised to see it happen this time. But you never know, and you know, some of us like this stuff. We sit up late to watch it. Assuming it, well, no network will cover the convention anymore, but thank goodness for C-SPAN.
Yes.
You may have answered this, and if you did, I apologize. But you talk about you have so many Democrats and so many Republicans. Where do you actually find the people that you poll?
We get the number of Democrats and Republicans from what people tell us. So we don't go to do a sample of so many Dems and so many reps. We do a sample of the state as a whole, and we simply ask people, generally speaking, do you think of yourself as a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent? And then if you're an independent, would you say you're closer to the Democratic Party or closer to the Republican Party? Wisconsin, unlike a number of other states, including Florida, for example, does not have partisan registration. So you register to vote, but you don't register as a Democrat or a Republican. That also means we have open primaries. You show up at the polls, you can choose which primary you vote in. In states with partisan registration, if you're a registered Republican, you have to vote in the Republican primary in most cases. And so there is no definitive measure of how many Republicans, Democrats, and independents there are in the state, other than just asking people. And in fact, it turns out in the states that have party registration, it turns out that the way people register doesn't necessarily line up that closely with how they vote or how they think of themselves. So that's why we do it the way we do. One advantage of, this is now our 30th statewide survey, is we can look back over that time, and I opened by telling you what the averages of each of these groups were over time. And we see almost no samples out of that set that's more than 2 or 3 points different from the long-term average. And most are actually closer than that. So partisanship, unlike vote choice, is a surprisingly stable attitude where we do see some fluctuations. And if you look in national data, you can see periods, especially between elections, where partisans, the percentage of partisans nationally kind of trend down a little bit, but it trends down 2, 3, 4 percentage points. It doesn't move the way, say, presidential approval might, up or down 15 or 20 points. And so partisanship ends up, in our measure and in most of the political science literature, as being a psychological attachment to a party. And how do you measure that? You just ask people. And it turns out their answers are remarkably stable, with a little bit of drift. One last thing, I know you're trying to get a follow-up, but you know, you asked, and so I can't stop myself, is that where you do see a bit of movement is among those independents that lean to one party or the other. And so I mentioned earlier that in our sample this year, the leaners are just about 3 points more Democratic than Republican, as opposed to exactly balanced, which we've seen most of the time in the past. So that could be that people are allowing themselves, independents are allowing themselves to drift a little bit towards the Democratic Party right now, but that could come back. Could also be that you're seeing a little bit of a difference in who's more interested, more excited about the elections. That's also accounting for that. I don't have a direct answer for which of those might be the right answer. Now, let you back in.
Where do you get the names to start with?
We get a list of all the area codes and exchanges in the state. Phone company can give you that. And then we generate 4 digits at the end so that every number between 0000 and 9999 has exactly the same chance of being picked. And we do that for both cell phone exchanges and landline exchanges. And so that pull an area code and exchange, add a random 4 digits. And when you've done that enough times, every number in the state has had exactly an equal chance of being selected into the sample. And then we call you, and I want you to be at home waiting for you. So that's the last step. Who's home and who picks up, and that's beyond our control. But drawing that sample is something we have mathematical theorems for. Getting people to cooperate, or actually getting people to simply pick up the phone. The vast majority of non-responses are from numbers that are never answered. It could be because nobody's home. It could be because the phone has recently been disconnected or something like that. When people do pick up, about 40 to 50% agree to do an interview.
Please pick up. We had an interesting story on Sunday. A guy, I tweeted about the poll coming out on Wednesday, and he complained that he has not been called yet. And so I said, well, that's surprising that you haven't been called. And of course, Charles chimed in on Twitter criticizing him for not sitting by his phone. He was out looking at the lunar eclipse.
How can you possibly go out and look at the moon when we were in the field? You know?
Stay next to that. We'll go here and then here. Go ahead.
Charles, I guess the geographic location of those phone numbers, do you have a breakdown, urban versus rural? And compare to previous polls as
Sure.
well? Thank you.
So this is something called stratification, which when I said we draw the numbers this way, I lied. We do some bells and whistles, one of which is to eliminate business phone numbers and exchanges, right? So it doesn't make much sense to call 414-288 because you're going to get Marquette University, okay? And so the company that we actually buy the sample from pre-screens those out. So that's a bell and whistle. The answer to your part of the question is, we know how many registered voters live in every region of the state. And the way we break it down is the city of Milwaukee, which is 9.5% of registered voters in the state. The rest of the Milwaukee media market, which is 30.5%. So the entire Milwaukee media market's about 40% of registered voters. Madison's just under 20, Green Bay's just about 20, and the rest of the state's about 26%. So when we get those phone numbers, we draw them so that we know we're getting the right percentages within those geographic regions. And so every sample will come back very close, not exactly the same, but quite close to what we know the geographic distribution is. And that's very easy to do, and what it does is it improves the quality of the sample in a technical way that I won't write the algebra on the board for you. But it shrinks the margin of error a little bit, and it provides more stability. Now, there are two other things that we deal with, three other things, that we deal with routinely as well. One is not a big deal, and that's gender. Registered voters are about 53% female, 47% male. And we usually end up with a sample that's pretty close to that, within a point or so, 50-50, 51-49. I think this one actually came in 53-47. But the two that are problematic for us and for every poll are age, because young people are hard to get on the phone. Call my daughter, find out. And the other is that more educated people are more interested and willing to do an interview. And so of the two, the age difference is probably the biggest. 18 to 29-year-olds are about 16% of registered voters in the state, but they're typically only 7 or 8% of our raw sample. But that reflects the difficulty of reaching them, even when you're calling 45% cell phones. The education differences are not as sharp, but there are consistent education differences. Since we don't know who's at the other end of those numbers we're calling, there's no way we can say ahead of time we're going to get X percentage of young people, Y percentage of college grad. So there we do something called post-stratification, which when the data are finished, come in. We weight the data so that those groups that we know are underrepresented compared to voter registration statistics are weighted up, and those who are overrepresented are weighted down. So our final weighted sample matches the population very closely on region, sex, education, and age. And so that's all in the methodology appendix if you want to rush off and read that. I'm sorry.
I was wanting to.
Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't see. That's the problem with sitting at this angle.
I was wanting to make sure I heard something accurately. I think you said that President Obama's job approval ratings are most in league with those of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. Is that accurate?
No, I'm sorry, I may have misspoken. What I was saying is that the variation in Obama's ratings is the smallest amount of variation of any president since Roosevelt and Truman. He comes into office with a good approval rating, but it's actually sort of the middle range of post-war presidents. Then in 2009 and 2010, his approval rating falls off as you get past the honeymoon and things become controversial and so on. But since that time, the amount of variation you see in his approval nationally is considerably smaller than what you see for other recent presidents.
Having a hard time with this.
There you go.
Okay, how's that? All right, but didn't Roosevelt's approval ratings slip as well?
Yeah, no, that's my point, is that Roosevelt, had all the advantages of the war, of course, but rose and fell quite a bit in the period. Harry Truman goes up and down. JFK was fairly high most of his time, but also had some ups and downs, and that's true of just about every president. If we go back to the first President Bush, who set the record with a 94% approval rating at one point, the start of the Gulf War. And the second President Bush that was, I think, 1 percentage point behind him. Both fell off into the 30s and the second President Bush into the 20s over the course of their term. With President Obama, we've never seen the average dip into the 30s, and it has rarely gone up into the 50s. So there's this range that's very narrow that he stayed in negative on approval most of his term. But the net negative is far less net negative than you saw late in President Bush's term. And likewise, President Obama's high points have not been, again, with the exception of the honeymoon period, anywhere near as high as, say, Bill Clinton's were, or parts of Ronald Reagan's term, let alone the highs of the two Bushes.
So he's been a pretty consistent fellow.
He's been quite consistent. Part of the reason, of course, the issue is he's been pretty consistent. Yes, the reason is Republicans have been rating him at 10% or less for years. So you just can't pull it down any lower, right? Democrats have been quite consistent in the high 70s and 80s most of the time with relatively modest movement. And independents have not really moved around all that much, about a 10-point movement. So the same thing happened late in second President Bush's term, when it was Democrats that had fallen to 10% or less. And it was only when Republicans started to lose confidence in him that he finally dipped down into the 20s. But it wasn't because of Democrats who were already at the bottom. And essentially you've seen the same thing in reverse with President Obama.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm gonna have to wrap things up because it is 1:15. Let me say a couple things before we go. Thanks to Charles for going through the latest results of the law school poll. Thanks to all of you for your interest and attention today. And our next event will be October 7th. We do a lot of events here that focus on education, public education, private education. And we're going to be talking about one of the newest schools in the city, which is called Cristo Rey Jesuit High School. Kind of an interesting combination of academics and workforce training. Kids go to work at the same time. So it's a new school, a lot of interest right now coming off the Pope's visit. So we'll be talking to the president, Andrew Stiff, and somebody who attended the Cristo Rey School in Chicago, Marisa Contreras, will be with us. So if you're interested in education, I think it'll be a good hour, and we hope you can join us. Having said that, thanks very much again. We'll see you next time on the issue.